1,000 miles from the European battlefields, beneath the shadow of the Himalayas, men fought and died in a jungle that swallowed armies whole. It was a battle of mud, monsoon, and madness, where courage met starvation, and the line between victory and annihilation blurred forever. This is the Battle of Imphal, the Forgotten Front of Burma. Hello and welcome back to Forgotten WW2 Archives, where we uncover the lost stories of World War, two battles the world forgot, but the soldiers never did. Today we journey deep into the jungles of northeast India, to a place where the British Empire fought one of its most desperate and decisive battles, the Battle of Imphal, 1944. In the spring of 1944, the world's attention was fixed on Europe. The Allies were preparing for D-Day, and the Red Army was driving back the Germans. But far to the east, in the steaming jungles of Burma, another colossal struggle was unfolding, one that would decide the fate of India itself. The Japanese Imperial Army, desperate to halt the British counter-offensive in Burma, planned an audacious invasion through the dense mountains separating Burma and India. Their goal, to capture the city of Imphal, join forces with the Indian National Army led by Subhas Chandra Bose, and ignite a revolt that would bring down British rule in India. The Japanese called it Operation U-Go. They believed that if they could break the British at Imphal, India would rise in rebellion. It was a gamble bold, brilliant, and ultimately suicidal. Imphal, nestled in a valley ringed by jungle-covered hills, was the key to the British defense of India's eastern frontier. Its airfields and supply depots made it a vital base for the Allied push into Burma. Holding Imphal meant holding the door to India. Losing it meant opening that door to invasion. In early March 1944, as the monsoon clouds gathered on the horizon, 3 Japanese divisions, the 15th, 31st, and 33rd, under Lieutenant General Rinya Mutaguchi, began their march through some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth. Their path took them through narrow mountain trails, deep valleys, and dense jungle where leeches, malaria, and starvation were as deadly as bullets. Each soldier carried only what he could on his back, expecting to capture British supplies once they reached Imphal. It was a plan driven by optimism and blind faith. Facing them was the British 14th Army, under General William Slim. Slim was no ordinary commander. He was pragmatic, humble, and deeply respected by his men. He knew the jungle could be both ally and enemy. His strategy was simple: hold the line, keep the supply routes open, and let the Japanese exhaust themselves. Unlike earlier British campaigns in the Far East, Slim's troops were better trained, better fed, and far better prepared for jungle warfare. The defenders of Imphal were a mix of British, Indian, Gurkha, and African units men from across the empire, united in a desperate stand. They had learned hard lessons from their earlier defeats in Malaya and Burma. They knew how the Japanese fought swift, silent, and fanatical. But this time, the Allies had air superiority, better intelligence, and stronger morale. As March turned to April, the storm broke. The Japanese struck from the east, north, and south, encircling Imphal in a tightening ring. Battles erupted across the hills at Sangshak, Tiddim Road, and Bishan, Pur, as the Japanese tried to cut off every escape route. The British and Indian troops found themselves surrounded, their supply lines severed. For weeks they held out, fighting from hastily dug trenches and bunkers, often knee-deep in mud, short of food, and plagued by disease. Every hill became a fortress, every river crossing a death trap. Inside the valley, Imphal itself was under siege. The Japanese artillery pounded the airfields daily, trying to destroy the Allied lifeline. But the skies became the Allies' salvation. Using Dakotas and transport aircraft, the Royal Air Force and American planes flew in supplies and evacuated the wounded, often under heavy fire. It was one of the largest and most daring air supply operations of the war. For the first time, an entire army was sustained entirely by air, a feat that changed modern warfare. Yet for the men on the ground, survival was a minute-to-minute struggle. The monsoon hit in full fury by late May. The skies opened, drenching everything in unending rain. Rivers overflowed, roads vanished, and the jungle became a sea of mud. The Japanese, already short of food and medicine, began to starve. Their supply lines, stretched thin across mountains and swamps, collapsed. Many soldiers resorted to eating roots, bark, even the flesh of their dead comrades. The jungle, once their ally, had turned against them. Still, they fought on with terrifying determination. At night, Japanese infantry would launch banzai charges, screaming as they rushed through the rain, bayonets gleaming in lightning flashes. The defenders responded with machine, gunfire, and grenades, lighting the darkness with explosions. It was a nightmare of sound and fury, a world reduced to rain, blood, and screams. Among the defenders, the Indian soldiers fought with extraordinary bravery. The Gurkhas, wielding their kukris, defended their positions to the last man. African troops from Nigeria and West Africa held key outposts, proving that the empire's strength came from its diversity. The British officers often said, without the Indians and Gurkhas, Imphal would have fallen. Meanwhile, in the Japanese command, chaos was growing. General Mutaguchi refused to believe his plan was failing. Convinced that victory was near, he ordered more attacks, more sacrifices. His men obeyed even as they collapsed from hunger and disease. Discipline began to crumble. Bodies littered the trails. Entire units disappeared into the jungle, never to be seen again. By June, the siege had lasted nearly 3 months. The defenders at Imphal were exhausted, but the Japanese were breaking. The tide was turning, though no one on the ground could yet see it. General Slim was preparing a counter-attack, one that would not only lift the siege, but destroy the Japanese army in Burma. But before that moment of reversal came, Imphal's defenders would endure their darkest days of despair, heroism, and unimaginable suffering. By late June 1944, the valley of Imphal had become a nightmare that no soldier would ever forget. The rain never stopped. The jungle steamed under the monsoon, leeches clung to bare skin, and corpses lay half buried in the mud. The smell of rot and gunpowder hung in the air. Every ridge, every narrow track was soaked with blood. The British and Indian defenders had been under siege for nearly 3 months, but their spirit, though battered, had not broken. Inside Imphal, tents and trenches turned into swamps. Soldiers slept sitting upright in water, filled foxholes. Ammunition was rationed, food was scarce, and medical supplies were running out. Yet every morning they climbed out of the mud, cleaned their weapons, and prepared to fight again. The radio crackled with whispers that reinforcements were coming, that the siege would soon be lifted. For many, hope was the only thing that kept them alive. In the skies above, Allied aircraft roared through the monsoon storms. The air supply operation, the largest ever attempted in Asia, became the lifeline of the Imphal garrison. Pilots flew low through rain and fog, dropping ammunition, rations, and medicine onto makeshift landing strips, often under Japanese fire. Many planes never returned, but for the men on the ground, every crate that fell from the sky was a miracle, a reminder that they had not been forgotten. The Japanese, meanwhile, were facing a living hell. What had begun as a bold offensive had turned into a death march. Their supply lines were cut, their men starving, and disease spreading like wildfire. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion claimed more lives than bullets. Soldiers who once marched proudly under the rising sun now stumbled through the jungle as skeletons in tattered uniforms. Mutaguchi's vision of capturing Imphal and liberating India was disintegrating before his eyes. Yet, even as they starved, the Japanese soldiers refused to surrender. They fought with fanatical courage, clinging to every ridge and hilltop. Their motto was simple: better death than defeat. In the mountains around Imphal, units fought to the last man, often surrounded, sometimes charging into hopeless attacks. To the Allies, their bravery was both terrifying and tragic. One of the fiercest clashes erupted on the Tiddim road, a narrow, muddy track winding south of Imphal. Here, British and Indian troops fought to reopen their supply route. The Japanese had fortified the hills overlooking the road, turning them into deadly strongholds. Each position had to be taken by hand, grenade by grenade, bunker by bunker. In one assault, Gurkhas crept silently through the rain, using their curved kukris to strike in close combat. When dawn broke, the hill was theirs, but half the battalion lay dead or wounded. Elsewhere, near the village of Bishanpur, African troops from Nigeria fought side by side with Indian infantry, their machine guns firing until the barrels glowed red. The jungle echoed with gunfire and screams. Rain turned the earth to crimson mud. It was a scene out of hell, but it was the price of holding Imphal. Behind the front lines, General William Slim watched the battle unfold with quiet determination. He understood that victory would not come from brute strength, but from endurance. "We must outlast them," he told his officers. "The jungle will destroy them before we do." And he was right. The longer the Japanese stayed cut off, the weaker they became. Their army was collapsing from within. Inside Japanese headquarters, chaos reigned. Mutaguchi still believed he could win. He refused to retreat, insisting that his men press on toward Imphal, no matter the cost. His commanders pleaded with him, warning that their troops were starving, but Mutaguchi's pride blinded him. He had promised Tokyo victory, and he would not admit defeat. As a result, thousands of his men died needlessly in the hills around Imphal, their bodies left to rot in the rain. By July, the British counterattack began. Reinforcements had finally broken through from Kohima, another mountain town where a parallel siege had raged. The defenders of Kohima had held the line on a tennis court turned battlefield, and now, united with the Imphal garrison, they moved to crush the invaders once and for all. The tide was turning slowly, brutally, but decisively. From the air, Allied bombers pounded Japanese positions day and night. The once invincible Japanese columns were now scattered bands of starving men. Trucks lay abandoned, guns rusted in the rain, and dead soldiers marked the paths like grim milestones. The jungle that had once concealed them now devoured them. In the valley, the British and Indian troops advanced cautiously, clearing out the hills one by one. They found scenes of unimaginable horror, entire Japanese battalions reduced to bones, their diaries soaked in rain, pages filled with words of hunger, faith, and despair. Many had written letters to families they would never see again. Some had tied grenades to their chests, choosing suicide over capture. For the defenders of Imphal, the counterattack brought both relief and heartbreak. They had survived the siege, but at a terrible cost. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Men who once weighed 70 kilograms now weighed barely 40. Disease and exhaustion were everywhere. Yet, when the Japanese began to retreat, cheers echoed across the valley. After months of fear and suffering, Imphal was finally free. On the outskirts of the city, Indian and British soldiers watched as Japanese stragglers stumbled away through the jungle. Few would ever make it back to Burma. Of the 85,000 Japanese troops who had crossed the border in March, more than half were dead. Thousands more were missing, presumed lost to the jungle. The British called it a victory. The Japanese called it a tragedy. History would call it one of the greatest defeats in Japan's military history. But amid the chaos of retreat, some Japanese officers refused to surrender. Small groups continued to fight rearguard actions, ambushing patrols and sniping from the trees. The jungle was filled with ghosts men who refused to die or be captured. It would take months to clear them all. In Imphal itself, The survivors emerged from their trenches, blinking in the pale sunlight. The monsoon clouds were breaking. For the first time in months, they saw blue sky. Airplanes circled overhead, dropping supplies not for survival now, but for celebration. Bands played, flags were raised, and messages of victory were broadcast across the valley. Yet, behind the smiles, there was grief. Thousands of friends were gone. Many would never return home. General Slim addressed his troops, his words simple but heartfelt. "You have fought in one of the hardest battles of this war," he said. "You have held the line against the best Japan could send, and you have triumphed. The road to Burma lies open, and from Burma, the road to victory in the east." The men cheered, but they knew the war was far from over. Ahead lay the reconquest of Burma, the final chapter in a brutal campaign that had cost so much. The jungles still waited, silent and deadly, but the worst, the siege of Imphal, was over. The valley that had once been a trap had become a symbol of endurance, of courage, and of redemption. For the British Empire, it was proof that the tide of war had turned. For India, it was a sign that the soldiers of the Raj, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Gurkha alike could fight as one. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end in the east. The monsoon clouds that had swallowed the Imphal Valley for months finally began to lift in July 1944. As the mist cleared from the green hills, what it revealed was not victory's glory, but its price. The fields were littered with wrecked trucks, broken helmets, rusted rifles, and the unburied dead. Jungle vines were already creeping over the fallen, wrapping them in silence. The Battle of Imphal was over, but the land itself seemed to mourn what had happened there. For the men who had survived, it was difficult to believe they were still alive. After nearly 4 months of siege, starvation, and disease, they moved through the ruins of their positions in disbelief. Some walked barefoot, their boots rotted away long ago. Others leaned on sticks, too weak to stand straight. Yet, in their eyes burned the quiet fire of men who had endured the impossible. They had not just held a line, they had stopped an empire. The Japanese retreat from Imphal was one of the most devastating in military history. Those who could still walk began the long journey back to Burma, through mountains now turned into rivers of mud. There were no supply lines, no food, no medicine. The jungle took them one by one. Thousands collapsed along the trails, dying where they fell. Many were buried by the rain itself. When Allied patrols later followed those routes, they found bones scattered like leaves. Of the 85,000 Japanese who had marched into India, fewer than 30,000 ever returned. The rest were swallowed by the land they had tried to conquer. In Tokyo, the news was met with disbelief and silence. General Mutaguchi, the man who had planned Operation U-Go, was dismissed from command. He had gambled everything, his men, his reputation, and Japan's hopes of invading India, and lost it all. His army had been annihilated. For Japan, the defeat at Imphal, combined with the disaster at Kohima, marked the turning point in the Burma Campaign. Never again would the Imperial Japanese Army advance into India. From that moment on, they would fight only to delay the inevitable. For the Allies, Imphal was more than a military victory, it was a psychological triumph. Just 2 years earlier, the British had been driven out of Burma in one of the worst defeats in their history. Now they had not only stopped the Japanese onslaught, but destroyed their best divisions. General Slim's 14th Army, often called the Forgotten Army, had proven that the Japanese could be beaten in the jungle. Imphal became the symbol of a new confidence, a turning of the tide in the east. But even in victory, Slim was haunted by the cost. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded. Thousands more were sick with malaria and dysentery. Entire units had been reduced to shadows. The hospitals overflowed with men too weak to speak, their faces drawn and hollow. Nurses and doctors worked around the clock, often crying as they cleaned wounds that could not heal. The valley, once green and full of life, had become a graveyard. In the villages surrounding Imphal, the local population suffered terribly too. Civilians fled into the hills as shells rained down on their homes. Many starved or were caught between the warring armies. Yet many Manipuri villagers risked their lives to carry food, water, and messages to the Allied troops. They became the silent heroes of the campaign, their bravery rarely recorded in official histories, but remembered by those who survived. Among the Indian troops there was a deep sense of pride. They had fought not just for the British crown, but for honor and for the hope of a free future. For many, Imphal proved that Indian soldiers could fight with unmatched courage and discipline. Gurkhas, Sikhs, Rajputs, Punjabis, Pathans, men from every corner of the subcontinent had stood shoulder to shoulder and prevailed. When the story of Imphal spread across India, it became part of a new narrative, one of strength, unity, and sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Indian National Army under Subhas Chandra Bose, which had marched with the Japanese, faced its own tragedy. Many of its soldiers, who had dreamed of liberating India from British rule, found themselves abandoned in the jungle, starving beside their Japanese allies. The dream of an invasion of India was shattered. In the years to come, the INA trials in India would reignite the independence movement, but at Imphal, the reality of war had stripped away all illusions. It was not glory they found in those hills, only loss. As the monsoon ended, General Slim began preparing for the next phase, the reconquest of Burma. Using Imphal as a base, the Allied armies advanced southward, determined to finish what they had begun. The lessons learned at Imphal guided every step. Never underestimate the jungle, trust the air supply, and fight as one army, regardless of race or regiment. Over the next year, Slim's men would retake Mandalay, cross the Irrawaddy, and finally capture Rangoon. When victory in Burma was declared in 1945, the road had begun in the valley of Imphal. But for the soldiers who had fought there, peace was not simple. Many returned home changed forever. They carried memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, the faces of comrades lost, the endless rain, the cries from the dark. Some never spoke of it again. Others wrote letters, diaries, and poems, trying to make sense of what they had seen. One British soldier later wrote, "Imphal was not a battle, it was a test of the human spirit. And in that test, we learned what endurance truly means." In Japan, the survivors of the Imphal campaign were regarded with sorrow and respect. They had fought bravely, but in vain. Many believed their defeat had been ordained by fate. The jungles of Burma became sacred ground, a place where tens of thousands of souls had vanished. After the war, Japanese veterans would return to those mountains to build small shrines and lay flowers for their fallen comrades. They prayed not for revenge, but for peace. Today, when historians speak of World War II, the battles of Europe and the Pacific often dominate the story: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. But in the hills of northeast India, at Imphal and Kohima, a battle just as decisive was fought and won. It was here that Japan's advance in Asia was finally broken. The victory ensured that India remained free from invasion and opened the way for the liberation of Southeast Asia. Churchill himself called Imphal and Kohima the greatest defeat ever suffered by Japan. Yet, despite its importance, the Battle of Imphal remains one of the least remembered fronts of World War II. The men who fought there did not return to parades or fame. They returned quietly, their heroism buried beneath the noise of history. But the jungle remembers. The hills around Imphal still hide rusted helmets, shattered rifles, and nameless graves. In the silence, one can almost hear the echo of distant gunfire, the low hum of aircraft, the whispers of soldiers who once fought and fell there. In recent years, memorials have been built in Imphal to honor the fallen, both Allied and Japanese. The Imphal War Cemetery, with its rows of white gravestones, stands as a testament to their sacrifice. Each stone bears a name, a rank, and an age reminders that war is not made of numbers, but of human lives. Visitors from across the world come to pay their respects, to remember a battle that changed the fate of Asia. As the sun sets over the valley, the fields that once shook with explosions now lie peaceful and green. The wind moves gently through the grass, carrying with it the unspoken words of those who died there. Their story, the story of Imphal, is a reminder that courage is not born in comfort, but in suffering, that unity can rise even from chaos, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones the world forgets. This was the Battle of Imphal, the Forgotten Front of Burma, a story of endurance, sacrifice, and redemption, a story the world must never forget.